Bullies slapped a disabled girl in a diner. An hour later, bikers walked in. Sometimes cruelty and justice collide in the most unexpected places. The events that unfolded that day would change everyone's perspective on appearances forever. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Maplewood Diner had always been Clara's sanctuary on Saturday mornings. The familiar scent of maple syrup and fresh coffee usually wrapped around her like a warm blanket, offering comfort in a world that often felt designed for everyone but her. Today, however, something felt different. The golden sunlight streaming through the windows couldn't quite reach the shadows gathering at the edges of the room. Clara positioned her wheelchair carefully at her favorite window booth, the one that gave her a perfect view of the oak trees lining Main Street. Her pancakes arrived steaming, dotted with melting butter and drowning in syrup, exactly how she liked them. She smiled at the waitress who placed the plate before her with a gentle nod before hurrying off to serve other customers. That's when she noticed them. 4 teenage boys, hunched at the booth directly across from hers, their shoulders shaking with barely contained laughter. Clara tried to focus on cutting her pancakes, but she couldn't ignore their stares boring into her. Their whispers carried just enough for her to catch fragments. Wheels, special, retard, each word a small knife slipping between her ribs. She kept her eyes down, hoping they would grow bored and find someone else to torment. The diner hummed with the usual weekend chatter, silverware clinking against plates, the coffee machine hissing in the background. None of it could drown out the escalating voices from the boys' booth. "Hey, special ed," one of them called out, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. "Do they let you feed yourself now?" Clara's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her fork tighter, determined not to give them the satisfaction of a response. The tallest boy, wearing a red varsity jacket, nudged his friend and snickered. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Red Jacket slid from his seat and sauntered toward her table. With a deliberate flick of his wrist, he slapped the plate from Clara's lap, sending pancakes, syrup, and ceramic crashing to the floor. "Oops," he sneered. "Looks like you need more practice." Before Clara could process what had happened, another boy shoved her wheelchair, causing it to roll backward and spin slightly. The sudden movement made her grab the table edge to steady herself, her knuckles turning white with the effort. The crash of the plate had silenced the entire diner. Forks paused midway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every eye turned toward Clara, sitting amid the wreckage of her breakfast. Syrup splattered across the floor and her clothes. Time seemed suspended in that moment, a tableau of cruelty met with collective, deafening silence. No one moved, no one spoke, and, in that frozen moment, Clara felt more alone than she ever had before. The laughter of the boys ricocheted off the worn walls of Maplewood Diner, drowning out even the clatter of the fallen plates. Their cruel amusement hung in the air like a poisonous cloud, suffocating everyone present. Clara sat frozen in her wheelchair, her breakfast scattered across the checkered floor tiles. The pancakes she had been looking forward to, golden and fluffy just moments ago, now lay in a sad, syrupy puddle. Clara's chin trembled as she fought to contain the tears welling in her eyes. She had learned long ago that showing weakness only encouraged tormentors. But this public humiliation cut deeper than the boys could possibly understand. The young student had developed thick skin through years of sideways glances and whispered comments. But being targeted so brazenly, so cruelly, in front of an entire restaurant full of people, this was different. "Look at her face," one of the bullies snickered, pointing at Clara's reddening cheeks. Another mimicked her trembling hands with exaggerated motions, sending his friends into another round of heartless laughter. For Clara, each day already presented a gauntlet of challenges. Doorways too narrow, counters too high, people too impatient. She navigated a world not built for her with quiet dignity. But this moment of deliberate cruelty threatened to shatter the careful composure she maintained daily. The food on the floor represented more than a ruined breakfast. It was a public declaration of her vulnerability, her difference laid bare for all to witness. Around the diner, the morning crowd shifted uncomfortably in their seats. An elderly couple near the window exchanged troubled glances. The man with graying temples at the counter stared into his coffee cup, his knuckles whitening around the mug. A businessman folded his newspaper with deliberate slowness, his lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Yet despite their discomfort, no one moved to intervene. No one stood to confront the boys or comfort Clara. The waitress hovered uncertainly by the kitchen door, coffee pot clutched to her chest like a shield, her eyes darting between Clara and the group of tormentors. The silence of the onlookers seemed to amplify the boys' power. They sprawled confidently in their booth, elbowing each other and making no attempt to lower their voices as they continued their mockery. One of them casually tossed a wadded napkin in Clara's direction, missing her but making his contempt clear. In that moment, Clara had never felt more alone. The wheelchair that gave her mobility now seemed to isolate her completely, marking her as different, separate, someone whose dignity could be violated without consequence. She stared at her trembling hands, wishing desperately that she could simply disappear. Clara's trembling hands reached for the scattered remains of her breakfast, pancake pieces and syrup now mingling with the dust of the diner floor. Her cheeks burned with humiliation as she struggled to lean forward in her wheelchair, the metal frame restricting her movement. Each second felt like an eternity as she tried to clean up the mess that wasn't her fault. "Please, just let me disappear," she thought, her fingers grazing the sticky floor tiles. The laughter from the boys' table continued, their mockery a soundtrack to her humiliation. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, watching, judging, yet doing nothing. The waitress stood frozen in the middle of the aisle, coffee pot in one hand, several mugs balanced in the other. The woman's face reflected a battle between duty and fear, clearly wanting to help, but paralyzed by the confrontation. Her hesitation spoke volumes in the tense atmosphere of Maplewood Diner. I should say something, the waitress thought, but the words remained trapped behind her lips. The steam from the coffee rose between her and Clara, a visible barrier separating help from those who needed it. All around the restaurant, the morning regulars suddenly found their plates fascinating. An elderly couple by the window studied their toast with unusual intensity. A businessman stirred his coffee as if solving a complex equation. A mother hushed her curious child who pointed at Clara, redirecting the young one's attention to the colorful menu. The silence was deafening. Only the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of silverware punctuated the uncomfortable quiet that had fallen over the establishment. Clara felt the weight of their collective avoidance crushing her spirit. This was worse than the bullying itself, the silent complicity of ordinary people who chose the comfort of inaction over the discomfort of standing up for someone vulnerable. She had experienced this isolation before, but never so publicly, never so completely. The wheelchair that gave her mobility now felt like a spotlight, drawing attention to her difference while simultaneously rendering her invisible as a person deserving of dignity. A napkin slipped from her grasp, and Clara fought back tears. In that moment, she wasn't just alone in her struggle against the cruelty of those boys. She was alone in a room full of people who had made the choice to look away. The weight of their collective silence pressed down on her shoulders, heavier than any physical burden she had ever carried. As Clara sat trembling in her wheelchair, surrounded by the wreckage of her breakfast and the crushing weight of dozens of stares, a gentle hand appeared in her field of vision. An older man with silver streaks at his temples bent down beside her, his movements deliberate and calm. Without fanfare or announcement, he carefully retrieved her plate from the floor, and placed it on the table in front of her. "Don't mind them," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the persistent snickering from the Bullies' booth. His eyes, creased at the corners from years of smiling, held a quiet dignity that momentarily steadied Clara's racing heart. The stranger's kindness, though small in the grand scheme of things, felt like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning. Clara managed a shaky nod of gratitude as the man straightened up, his hand briefly resting on the back of her wheelchair in a gesture of support before he returned to his own table. The diner had fallen into an uncomfortable quiet, punctuated only by the clinking of silverware and the muffled laughter of the boys who seemed emboldened rather than chastened by the lack of consequences. A waitress, who had witnessed everything while balancing a tray of coffee mugs, finally approached Clara's table, her face a mask of professional sympathy that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Can I get you something else, honey?" she asked, but her voice carried the unmistakable undercurrent of someone who wanted the uncomfortable situation to simply disappear. Clara shook her head, unable to form words past the knot in her throat. The pancakes she'd been looking forward to lay scattered and inedible, much like her sense of security. Though grateful for the older gentleman's intervention, she couldn't shake the feeling of being utterly exposed, a spectacle for everyone to witness but few to defend. The small flame of compassion that the man had ignited with his simple act flickered precariously against the overwhelming darkness of her humiliation. Clara stared down at her hands, which had stopped trembling but now felt cold and numb. The leather of her wheelchair's armrests, usually a source of stability and independence, now felt like a marker that separated her from everyone else in the room. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself, but the shadow of shame refused to lift. The older man caught her eye from across the room and offered a reassuring nod. But even his kindness couldn't fully penetrate the wall of isolation that had built itself around her in the wake of such public cruelty. Clara sat hunched in her wheelchair, staring at the scattered remains of her breakfast on the plate. The pancakes she had been looking forward to now sat untouched. Her appetite vanished like morning mist. Her throat felt tight, constricted by words she couldn't voice and tears she refused to shed in public. The diner continued its morning routine around her, but to Clara, every sound seemed amplified. The clink of silverware against plates, the hiss of the coffee machine, and worst of all, the continued laughter from the booth where the boys sat, now celebrating their cruelty as if it were some kind of victory. "Did you see her face?" one of them whispered. Not quite quietly enough. Another burst of laughter followed, sending a wave of heat rushing to Clara's cheeks. She gripped the wheels of her chair, knuckles whitening. Why? The question echoed in her mind like a prayer without answer. Why did people find joy in hurting those who were different? Why did the world allow such cruelty to exist? The older man who had helped her had returned to his newspaper, his small kindness already fading in the shadow of ongoing humiliation. Clara glanced around the diner. The waitress was avoiding her section now, busying herself with other tables. The other patrons had returned to their breakfasts, their momentary discomfort at witnessing her humiliation apparently eased by their decision to do nothing about it. Another roar of laughter erupted from the boys' table. Clara's heart pounded against her ribs so hard she feared everyone could hear it. Each laugh felt like a physical blow, reminding her of her vulnerability, her difference, her isolation. She had experienced cruelty before. The stares in school hallways, the whispered comments, the invitations never extended. But never so publicly, never so deliberately, never with such an audience of silent witnesses. The world outside the diner's windows continued its morning routine. Cars passed, people walked by, clouds drifted across the sky, all unaware of the storm raging inside her. Clara took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She would get through this hour. She would survive this moment as she had survived others. But knowing she would survive did little to ease the weight pressing down on her chest, the heavy understanding that for some people, her existence, her difference, was something to mock rather than respect. And perhaps worse was the knowledge that most people, when confronted with such cruelty, would choose the safety of silence over the risk of standing up for someone like her. Clara closed her eyes tightly, her knuckles white against the wheelchair's armrests. The remnants of her breakfast lay scattered on the floor, a visual reminder of the humiliation she'd just endured. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart as she silently prayed for time to accelerate, for this nightmare to dissolve into nothing more than a bad memory. "Please, just let this be over," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible above the ambient clatter of dishes and forced conversations that had resumed throughout Maplewood Diner. The young student could still feel the weight of stares on her, some sympathetic, others merely curious, but all unwelcome in this moment of vulnerability. Outside the large windows, people walked past on the sidewalk, going about their daily routines. Cars pulled in and out of parking spaces. The world continued its relentless forward motion, completely unaware of the storm of emotions brewing inside her. Clara watched a woman laugh while talking on her phone, and a small child skip alongside his mother. Their carefree expressions seemed to belong to a different universe than the one she currently inhabited. The Bullies were still at their booth, their laughter occasionally piercing through the diner's ambient noise like shards of glass. Each burst sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Clara's body. She fought the urge to wheel herself out the door, knowing that would only draw more attention and possibly encourage them to follow. Instead, she remained frozen in place, counting seconds, then minutes, willing the hour to pass. The waitress approached with a damp cloth and a sympathetic smile, kneeling to clean the mess on the floor. "I'm so sorry," she murmured, her eyes briefly meeting Clara's before darting away, heavy with unspoken guilt for not intervening sooner. Clara nodded in acknowledgement, but couldn't find words to respond. The kindness, though appreciated, felt like too little, too late. The older man who had helped earlier caught her eye from across the room and offered a gentle nod of solidarity. But even that small comfort couldn't dispel the heaviness in her chest. She traced the pattern on the tabletop with her fingertip, focusing on the swirls and lines to ground herself. Inside Maplewood Diner, the tension lingered like a fog, invisible yet palpable. Clara clung to the fragile hope that somehow this cruelty would not define her day, that something, anything, might shift the balance and restore her dignity. What she couldn't possibly know was that redemption was already rumbling toward the diner, carried on the thunder of motorcycle engines and the hearts of strangers who understood what it meant to be judged unfairly. An hour passed like a slow-moving glacier, each minute stretching into eternity for Clara. The diner had returned to its usual rhythm, silverware clinking against plates, coffee being poured, and conversations flowing freely. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, the young girl remained hunched in her wheelchair, the ghost of humiliation still hanging over her. Then everything changed. A distant rumble began to vibrate through the floor of Maplewood Diner. At first, it was barely perceptible, just a slight tremor that caused the water in glasses to ripple. But within seconds, the sound grew into a thunderous roar that commanded attention. One by one, conversations died mid-sentence. A fork clattered against a plate as its owner forgot to finish the motion of cutting his pancakes. "What on earth?" the waitress whispered, coffee pot suspended in mid-air, as she strained to look through the large windows that lined the front of the establishment. The rumble crescendoed into a mechanical symphony as dozens of motorcycles appeared on the horizon, their chrome exhaust pipes and polished metal gleaming like liquid silver under the morning sun. They moved as one coordinated unit, turning into the parking lot with military precision. Clara lifted her head, curiosity momentarily overriding her pain. She watched as the procession of bikes filled the lot, 20, 30, perhaps 40 motorcycles arranging themselves in perfect formation. Their riders sat tall and imposing, most wearing leather vests despite the warm weather, their faces weathered by sun and wind. Inside the diner, a hush fell over the room. Even the kitchen staff emerged to peer through the service window. The bullies, who had been loudly celebrating their cruelty just an hour before, suddenly grew quiet, their faces draining of color as they stared at the gathering outside. "Are those?" someone whispered. "Hell's Angels," an older patron confirmed, his voice a mixture of awe and trepidation. Clara watched as the riders dismounted in unison, moving with the coordinated grace of people accustomed to traveling as one. Their boots hit the pavement with heavy thuds that seemed to echo across the parking lot. The morning light caught on patches sewn to their vests, skulls, wings, and other insignias that marked them as members of the infamous motorcycle club. The entire diner held its breath as the bikers formed a line and turned toward the entrance. No one spoke, no one moved. Even the cook's spatula hung motionless above the grill. All eyes remained fixed on the door, waiting for whatever would happen next. The unmistakable insignia of the Hells Angels adorned the leather jackets of every rider as they dismounted their motorcycles in perfect formation. Each movement was deliberate and synchronized, as if they'd rehearsed this entrance 1,000 times. The chrome handlebars of their bikes caught the morning light streaming through the diner windows, casting dancing reflections across the ceiling. Their presence was formidable. 20 men and women, standing shoulder to shoulder, their engines idling like a gathering storm. Inside Maplewood Diner, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The group of boys who had tormented Clara just an hour earlier now sat rigid in their booth, their faces, previously animated with cruel laughter, drained of color as they recognized the notorious motorcycle club insignia. The tallest bully, who had been the first to mock Clara, swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly in his throat. "Are those really?" one of them whispered, unable to finish his sentence as his voice cracked with fear. "Shut up," hissed another, sliding lower in his seat as if trying to disappear beneath the table. Their smirks faded completely, replaced by unease and growing dread. The boys exchanged nervous glances, their earlier bravado evaporating like morning dew. The leader of their little group, who had slapped Clara's plate from her lap, now fidgeted with his napkin, tearing it into tiny pieces as sweat beaded on his forehead. The waitress paused mid-step, coffee pot suspended in her hand, watching as the bikers arranged themselves outside. Even the cook peered through the service window, spatula forgotten in his grip. Every patron in the establishment seemed to hold their breath, conversations dying mid-sentence as all eyes turned toward the parking lot. Clara, still seated in her wheelchair by the window, noticed the sudden silence. She looked up from her lap, where she'd been staring since the humiliation, and followed everyone's gaze outside. The sight of the motorcycles lined up precisely, their riders standing at attention, stirred something inside her. Not fear, but curiosity. One of the bullies attempted a nervous laugh. "They're probably just stopping for breakfast," he said, his voice unnaturally high. But his words hung hollow in the air as the first biker turned toward the entrance, his hand reaching for the diner door. The bell above the door would ring any second now, and everyone in Maplewood Diner knew that something momentous was about to happen. The bullies' reign of terror was coming to an end, though they didn't yet understand how completely their world was about to change. The bell above the door of Maplewood Diner jingled with a delicate chime that belied the gravity of what followed. As the door swung open, conversation died mid-sentence, forks paused halfway to mouths, and coffee cups hovered suspended between tables and lips. The silence that descended was so complete you could hear the sizzle from the grill in the kitchen. A towering figure filled the doorframe. Roar, with his thick beard and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 roads traveled. His leather vest was adorned with patches that told stories of brotherhood and journeys across America. Those steel-hard eyes scanned the room methodically, missing nothing, judging everything. Behind him, more Hell's Angels filed in, their boots making the floorboards creak beneath them. They moved with a coordinated precision that spoke of men who had ridden together through storm and sunshine. Each wore the unmistakable insignia that had made their club famous, or infamous, depending on who you asked. Clara sat frozen in her wheelchair, her earlier humiliation momentarily forgotten as she watched this unexpected scene unfold. Her eyes widened as she counted 5, then 10, then 15 bikers entering the establishment. The diner, which had seemed so vast during her moment of shame, now felt impossibly small with these men filling every corner of it. The waitress, who had been unable to help Clara earlier, now stood with her back pressed against the counter, coffee pot clutched to her chest like a shield. Other patrons shifted uncomfortably, some sliding lower in their seats, others pretending sudden fascination with the contents of their plates. The bullies, who had been laughing and joking just moments before, fell into a tense silence. One of them, the ringleader who had slapped Clara's plate, swallowed hard enough that Clara could see his Adam's apple bob from across the room. As the bikers spread throughout the diner, they created a presence that was palpable. The air itself seemed charged with potential energy, like the moment before lightning strikes. No one spoke, no one moved, everyone waited. Clara felt her heart hammering in her chest. These men, with their weathered faces and tattooed arms, represented a world so different from her daily reality of school hallways and medical appointments. Yet something in their disciplined entrance, in the respect they commanded without saying a word, stirred something inside her. A strange feeling, unexpected feeling, that perhaps the balance of power in the room was shifting. And then Roar's gaze found her, and for a breathless moment, their eyes locked across the diner. The diner felt eerily silent as the leather-clad bikers filled the space. Among them, a towering figure commanded attention without saying a word. Roar, with his weathered face and thick beard, stood at the entrance, his presence alone shifting the atmosphere. His eyes, sharp as steel yet carrying unexpected depth, methodically scanned the room. The bullies squirmed in their booth when his gaze lingered on them. Their earlier bravado melted away under his scrutiny, replaced by the unmistakable pallor of fear. Several of them stared intently at their plates, suddenly fascinated by half-eaten fries. When the motorcycle club leader's eyes finally found Clara, something remarkable happened. The hardness in his expression softened, not with pity. Clara had seen enough pity to last a lifetime, but with genuine understanding. It was as though he recognized something in her that others missed, a strength beneath her vulnerability that mirrored something in himself. With deliberate steps, Roar moved across the diner floor. His heavy boots thudded against the tiles, each step purposeful. The patrons watched, transfixed, as this intimidating figure approached the young girl in the wheelchair. Clara looked up, her hands still trembling slightly from the morning's humiliation. The biker leader knelt beside her, bringing himself to eye level. This simple act, choosing to meet her where she was rather than towering over her, spoke volumes. His massive frame, now positioned in a gesture of respect rather than intimidation, created a striking image against the backdrop of the ordinary diner. "You okay?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his stature. Clara nodded, though her eyes told a different story. "I saw what happened when we pulled up," he continued, keeping his voice low enough that only she could hear. "That ain't right." For the first time since entering Maplewood Diner that morning, Clara felt truly seen. Not as an object of mockery or pity, not as the girl in the wheelchair, but as a person worthy of dignity and respect. The tears that had been threatening to spill earlier now returned, but for entirely different reasons. Roar placed a weathered hand on the table beside her, not touching her, but offering a steady presence. "Nobody deserves to be treated like that," he said, the quiet authority in his voice leaving no room for argument. Clara managed a small smile, the first genuine one since the incident. In this unlikely guardian, she found something she'd been missing all morning. Someone willing to stand up and say that what happened to her mattered. Roar rose slowly from Clara's side, his massive frame unfolding like a mountain taking shape. The diner fell into a hush, so complete that the soft hum of the refrigerator behind the counter seemed thunderous. His weathered boots made deliberate contact with the floor as he turned toward the booth where the bullies sat. The group of boys, who had been so bold just an hour ago, now seemed to shrink in their seats, their faces previously animated with cruel laughter. Drained of color as the Hells Angels leader approached, one boy attempted to slide deeper into the booth, as if the vinyl seat might somehow swallow him whole. "You think that was funny?" Roar asked, his voice carrying the quiet danger of distant thunder. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The power in his controlled tone commanded more respect than any scream could have. "Picking on someone who can't fight back the same way you can?" Clara watched from her wheelchair, her hands still trembling slightly in her lap. Though she couldn't catch every word from where she sat, the transformation on the boys' faces told her everything. Shame colored their cheeks as Roar continued speaking, his words clearly cutting through their fragile armor of arrogance. "Where I come from," the bearded man said, leaning one tattooed forearm on their table, "we protect those who need protecting. We stand up for people who can't always stand up for themselves." He paused, letting his gaze move from one boy to the next. "What you did wasn't brave, it wasn't cool, it was cowardice." The tallest of the bullies, who had been the one to knock Clara's plate to the floor, stared at his hands. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, unable to meet the steely gaze fixed upon him. "I want you to look at her," Roar commanded, pointing toward Clara without turning away from them. "Actually look at her. That's a person with feelings, with dreams, with a life just as important as yours." The waitress, who had been frozen in place earlier, now stood with her order pad clutched to her chest, witnessing the quiet reckoning unfolding before her. One by one, the boys raised their eyes to Clara, their expressions a mixture of shame and dawning realization. Whatever bravado had fueled their cruelty earlier had evaporated completely. In its place was something Clara had never expected to see: regret. "Now," Roar said, straightening to his full height, "I think it's time for you to leave." His words weren't a suggestion. They carried the weight of an unavoidable consequence, as inevitable as gravity. The leader of the motorcycle club didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make the message clear. Their actions had consequences. And today, those consequences had arrived wearing leather. The tension in Maplewood Diner hung thick as fog as the first bully rose from his seat. His legs seemed to wobble beneath him. Confidence evaporated like morning dew. One by one, his companions followed suit, each face painted with the same mixture of shame and fear. They had entered as conquerors, but now retreated as cowards. The tallest boy, who had been the loudest in his mockery of Clara, couldn't bring himself to lift his gaze from the checkered floor tiles. His shoulders hunched forward, as if trying to make himself smaller, invisible to the dozens of eyes that followed his every step. The second youth stumbled slightly, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste to escape. The third kept glancing nervously at Roar, as if expecting the towering biker to change his mind about letting them leave unscathed. Clara watched their retreat with a strange sense of detachment. These boys, who had seemed so powerful and threatening just minutes ago, now appeared diminished, almost childlike in their fear. She didn't feel the satisfaction she might have expected, just a quiet relief that the nightmare was ending. As they shuffled toward the exit, the diner remained eerily silent. No one spoke, but everyone watched. The waitress, who had been frozen with coffee pots in hand during the earlier confrontation, now stood tall near the counter, her expression firm with newfound courage. The older man with graying temples, who had offered Clara that first small kindness, nodded slightly as the bullies passed his booth. The bell above the door jingled as they pushed through, the sound almost comically cheerful against the gravity of the moment. Outside, the sight that greeted them was equally intimidating. The parking lot, normally scattered with family sedans and pickup trucks, was now dominated by gleaming motorcycles arranged in perfect formation. The machines formed an imposing barrier, their chrome catching the midday sun and throwing it back in brilliant flashes. Several Hells Angels members stood beside their bikes, arms crossed, expressions unreadable behind sunglasses and beards. They made no move toward the boys, spoke no threats, but their presence alone communicated volumes. The bullies hurried past this gauntlet of silent judgment, heads down, practically running by the time they reached the street. Their earlier swagger had vanished completely, replaced by the urgent desire to be anywhere but here. Inside, Clara felt the atmosphere in the diner transform. What had been a place of humiliation now felt like sanctuary. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that it seemed impossible it had ever been otherwise. For the first time that morning, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, the weight on her chest finally beginning to lift. The diner had fallen into a reverent hush. Roar, the imposing leader of the Hells Angels, wasn't finished making his point. His weathered hand reached into the pocket of his leather jacket, producing a crisp $100 bill that he placed deliberately on the table. The waitress, who had been hovering nearby with anxious eyes, approached when he beckoned. "Ma'am," Roar said, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his stature, "I want you to bring this young lady anything she wants from your menu. Pancakes, milkshakes, pie, whatever her heart desires." He gestured toward Clara with a respectful nod. "And keep the change." The waitress nodded quickly, her earlier paralysis replaced by eager determination. "Of course," she said, offering Clara a warm smile. "Honey, our kitchen is yours. What would you like?" Clara's fingers trembled slightly as she wiped away the last of her tears. She hadn't expected this kindness, not after everything that had happened. The morning's humiliation had stolen her appetite. But something about the biker's generosity sparked a small flame of hunger again. "Maybe some fresh pancakes and a chocolate milkshake?" she asked, her voice gaining strength with each word. Roar pulled up a chair beside her wheelchair, his massive frame somehow making her feel protected rather than intimidated. The other club members had spread throughout the diner, their presence ensuring that the morning's peace would remain undisturbed. "You know something, Clara?" The bearded man leaned in, speaking just loudly enough for her to hear. "I've seen a lot in my time on the road. People who look tough, but crumble at the first sign of trouble. And people who seem fragile, but have steel in their souls." His eyes, which had seemed so hard when he first entered, now held a fatherly warmth. "You're the second kind." She looked up at him, uncertain. "Those boys?" He shook his head dismissively. "Cowards, every last one of them. But you've got more strength in your heart than they'll ever have in their bodies." The sincerity in his voice reached places inside Clara that had been wounded long before this morning. His words weren't empty platitudes. They carried the weight of someone who understood what it meant to be judged, to be an outsider. "Thank you," she whispered. The simple phrase carrying the weight of gratitude she couldn't fully express. The waitress returned with a fresh stack of pancakes, steam rising invitingly, and a chocolate milkshake topped with whipped cream and a cherry. As Clara took her first bite, she realized that food had never tasted so sweet. not because of what was on her plate, but because of the unexpected kindness that had served it. The diner had fallen into a reverent hush as Roar stood beside Clara's wheelchair. His massive frame, intimidating to most, now bent with surprising gentleness as he slipped his arms out of his leather vest. The patched garment, worn with pride and earned through years of brotherhood, carried weight far beyond its physical presence. "This belongs to you now," Roar said, his voice gruff yet tender as he carefully draped the vest across Clara's slender shoulders. The leather was still warm from his body, heavy with meaning and protection. "When you wear this, you're family. Nobody messes with family." Clara's fingers trembled as they traced the embroidered patches, each one telling a story she couldn't yet read but somehow understood. The vest engulfed her small frame, yet somehow it fit perfectly where it mattered most. "But I can't take this," she whispered, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his gesture. "This is yours. It's important." The bearded man shook his head firmly. "That's exactly why I'm giving it to you. Family protects its own." He knelt down to eye level with her, his weathered face softening. "Those boys? They're nothing. You're stronger than all of them put together, just by getting up every morning and facing a world that wasn't built for you." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, spilling down her cheeks in silent streams. Unlike the tears from earlier, these didn't burn with shame or humiliation. These tears cleansed and healed, washing away the morning's cruelty with each drop. The waitress, who had been frozen in fear earlier, now approached with a fresh napkin, gently offering it to the young girl. Around them, the other Hell's Angels formed a protective circle, their presence no longer threatening but reassuring. "We ride through town every month," Roar continued, his steel-hard eyes now surprisingly gentle. "Next time we come through, we'll stop by. Check on our newest member." One of the other bikers stepped forward, a woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes. "And if anyone gives you trouble again, you tell them who your family is," she added with a wink. Clara nodded, unable to speak through the emotion tightening her throat. The vest felt like armor against a world that had been so cruel just an hour before. She had entered Maplewood Diner as a target, isolated and vulnerable. She would leave as something else entirely, protected, valued, seen. "Thank you," she finally managed, her voice barely audible yet somehow filling the entire diner. Roar simply nodded, understanding that some gifts transcend words. In that moment, both giver and receiver recognized a truth often forgotten in the modern world. Family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who stands beside you when the rest of the world walks away. Within that single hour, Clara's life underwent a profound transformation. The weight that had pressed down on her shoulders since the moment those boys had mocked her disability seemed to lift, replaced by something she hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. The leather vest draped across her shoulders felt warm, like an embrace from a world she never expected would welcome her. Clara looked around the diner, seeing it through new eyes. The same space that had witnessed her humiliation now bore witness to her redemption. The waitress approached with a fresh plate of pancakes, her smile genuine as she set it down. "On the house," she whispered, squeezing Clara's shoulder gently. Roar remained beside her wheelchair, his imposing presence now a comfort rather than something to fear. The Hell's Angels members had spread throughout Maplewood Diner, ordering coffee and breakfast, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for them to be there. Their leather jackets and tattoos, which might have intimidated her before, now represented protection and acceptance. "You know," the bearded leader said, his voice surprisingly soft for such a large man, "people judge books by their covers all the time. They look at us and see trouble. They look at you and see limitation." He gestured toward her wheelchair. "But neither is true." Clara nodded, understanding washing over her like warm sunlight. The morning that had started with tears now held promise. She thought about how quickly life could change, how the universe sometimes sent exactly what you needed, even if it arrived in unexpected packaging. One of the other bikers approached, respectfully nodding to both Clara and Roar. "We're heading out in 15, he said, before adding with a smile directed at Clara, "unless our new friend needs anything else." The young student shook her head, overwhelmed by their kindness. "Thank you," she managed, her voice stronger than it had been all morning. What struck Clara most was the realization that kindness could emerge from the most unexpected sources. These men, with their rough exteriors and intimidating presence, had shown more compassion than anyone else in the diner that morning. They had seen her pain and acted without hesitation. As she took a bite of her fresh pancakes, Clara understood something fundamental about human nature. Sometimes the fiercest-looking people carried the gentlest hearts, and sometimes a single act of standing up for someone could rewrite their entire story. Her wheelchair, once a target for cruelty, had become the throne from which she witnessed humanity's capacity for good. The transformation wasn't just in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself, no longer defined by vulnerability, but by the strength of those who recognized her worth. A soft ripple of applause spread through Maplewood Diner, starting at a corner booth and flowing across the room like a gentle wave. Patrons who had earlier averted their eyes now openly wiped tears from their cheeks, bearing witness to the unexpected kindness that had transformed the morning. An elderly woman clutched her napkin to her heart, while a businessman in the corner booth nodded approvingly, his coffee forgotten. The waitress, who had stood frozen with coffee pots in hand during Clara's humiliation, now rushed to her side. Setting down her tray, she wrapped her arms around the young girl's shoulders, careful not to disturb Roar's leather vest that now draped protectively around Clara. "I'm so sorry I didn't help sooner," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "But I promise you, sweetheart, you will never feel invisible in this diner again. Not while I'm working here." Clara looked up at her, noticing the genuine remorse in the woman's eyes. She nodded, understanding that fear could paralyze even the kindest hearts. The waitress squeezed her hand before returning to the kitchen, returning moments later with a fresh stack of pancakes drizzled with extra syrup and topped with whipped cream and berries. Around her, the atmosphere in the restaurant had completely transformed. The other Hell's Angels members had settled into booths, their imposing presence now a comfort rather than a threat. Some patrons approached Clara's table, offering quiet words of support or simply a nod of respect. For Clara, the warmth spreading through her chest felt foreign yet familiar, like remembering something she'd forgotten long ago. Hope. It bloomed brighter than anything she had felt in months, perhaps years, washing away the bitter taste of humiliation that had lingered on her tongue just 30 minutes earlier. She ran her fingers along the edge of the leather vest, feeling the worn patches and subtle imperfections that told stories she had yet to learn. The courage of these strangers, especially Roar with his fierce exterior and gentle heart, had not just interrupted a moment of cruelty, but had completely reshaped her story. "Thank you," she said, looking up at Roar, who stood beside her table like a sentinel. He simply nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Family looks out for family," he replied, his deep voice carrying just far enough for her to hear. Clara smiled and cut into her pancakes, savoring each bite. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something beyond acceptance. She felt belonging. As the diner settled back into its rhythm, Clara found herself wrapped in the unexpected comfort of Roar's leather vest. The weight of it on her shoulders felt like armor, not the kind that separated her from the world, but the kind that reminded her she wasn't facing that world alone anymore. She watched the Hell's Angels members spread throughout the restaurant, their intimidating presence now transformed into something protective and warm. Some patrons still stared, but the nature of their gazes had changed completely. No longer were they looking at her with pity or awkward avoidance. Now their eyes held respect, perhaps even a touch of admiration. Clara ran her fingers along the edge of the vest, thinking about how quickly life could change. Just an hour ago, she had been the target of cruelty, her disability used as ammunition against her. The memory of the food hitting the floor still stung, but it was beginning to fade beneath the weight of what happened after. "Sometimes courage wears unexpected faces," the waitress said softly, refilling Clara's water glass. "Who would have thought, right?" Clara nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Courage wasn't always about physical strength or loud declarations. Sometimes it was quieter. A gray-haired man picking up a fallen plate, a waitress finding her voice after fear had stolen it, or a bearded biker kneeling beside a wheelchair. From across the room, Roar caught her eye and gave a slight nod. There was something in that simple gesture that spoke volumes, an acknowledgement that she wasn't defined by what had happened to her, but by her resilience in facing it. Clara realized that the world contained both darkness and light, often existing side by side. The same diner that had witnessed her humiliation was now witnessing her acceptance. The same morning that had started with tears was now filled with unexpected friendship. "You okay, kid?" one of the bikers asked, pausing beside her table. "I am now," she answered, and meant it. Perhaps the most powerful revelation was how strangers could rewrite your story. The bullies had tried to write her as a victim, but these unexpected allies had refused that narrative. With their arrival, they had crossed out that ending and offered a different one where she wasn't defined by her wheelchair or by the cruelty of others, but by the community that had risen to stand beside her. Clara took a deep breath and smiled. Today had taught her that courage came in many forms, and sometimes it arrived on the thunder of motorcycle engines. The story of Clara and the Hells Angels at Maplewood Diner reminds us that kindness often emerges from unexpected sources. This moment, where a group of bikers transformed humiliation into belonging, speaks to something fundamental in all of us. The contrast between the morning's cruelty and the biker's compassion illuminates how quickly life can change when someone chooses to stand up for what's right. Roar's simple act, draping his leather vest over Clara's shoulders, wasn't just about comfort. It represented protection, acceptance, and a declaration that she belonged to something larger than herself. The bikers, often feared and misunderstood, demonstrated the very compassion that the respectable patrons had failed to show. Stories like Clara's matter because they challenge our assumptions about who can be heroes. The waitress, initially frozen by fear, found her voice. The diner patrons, silent witnesses at first, eventually joined in celebrating this unexpected alliance. Even the older man with graying temples, who offered the first small kindness, played his part in this tapestry of compassion. If this account has touched your heart, please take a moment to support Kindness Corner. Like this video to help it reach others who might need this reminder of human decency. Share it with friends and family who could use a story of hope in their day. Subscribe to our channel to receive more tales that illuminate the best of humanity, even in difficult circumstances. Your comments below are especially valuable. They create a community of compassion that extends beyond this single story. When you share your reactions, you remind others they're not alone in believing that kindness matters. The support you provide helps Kindness Corner continue our mission of sharing stories that inspire, heal, and encourage compassionate action. In a world where negative news often dominates, these narratives serve as crucial counterbalance, proof that goodness persists and that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences. Remember that Clara's transformation from victim to family member happened in just 1 hour. Imagine what could happen if we all committed to similar acts of kindness in our own communities. The ripple effects might change countless lives, including our own. As we near the end of Clara's story, I want to ask something important of our Kindness Corner community. What would you have done If you had been sitting in Maplewood Diner that morning, would you have been among the silent witnesses, eyes cast down to your coffee cup, pretending not to notice? Or would you have found the courage to stand up, like the quiet older man with gray temples who offered that first small gesture of compassion? It's easy to watch these stories unfold from behind our screens and think, I would have helped. But in real moments of crisis, when a young girl in a wheelchair faces cruelty while everyone watches, courage becomes much harder to summon. The waitress herself stood frozen, coffee pot in hand, wanting to help but paralyzed by uncertainty. Perhaps you would have confronted the bullies directly. Maybe you would have simply moved to sit with Clara, offering silent solidarity when she needed it most. Or you might have called the manager, paid for her meal, or helped clean up the mess on the floor. Even the smallest action could have changed everything for her that day, long before Roar and his motorcycle club arrived. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your words might reach someone who finds themselves in a similar situation tomorrow, watching injustice unfold and wondering if they should act. Your comment could be the gentle push they need to find their voice or extend their hand when it matters most. Remember what happened in that diner. One person's courage inspired others. The older man's small gesture. The Hell's Angels' dramatic intervention. The waitress's eventual promise. Each action built upon the last until the entire atmosphere of Maplewood Diner transformed from fear to compassion. This is how kindness spreads. Not always through grand gestures like Roar's, but often through simple acts of human decency that inspire others to follow. Your story of how you would respond might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find their own courage. So please, take a moment to share below. Every comment is a potential spark, and every spark has the power to ignite courage in someone else's heart when they need it most. The morning that began with tears at Maplewood Diner had transformed into something no one could have predicted. Long after the rumble of motorcycles had faded into the distance, the impact of what happened remained etched in the memories of everyone present. Clara sat in her wheelchair by the window, Roar's leather vest still draped around her shoulders like armor, its weight comforting rather than burdensome. The waitress approached with a fresh plate of pancakes, her smile genuine as she set them down. "On the house," she said, squeezing Clara's shoulder gently. The young girl looked around the diner, noticing how differently people regarded her now, not with pity or avoidance, but with respect and warmth. What had unfolded that day was more than just an intervention. It was a lesson in human dignity. The Hell's Angels, feared by many for their intimidating appearance, had demonstrated that judgment based on outward appearances, whether of a girl in a wheelchair or men in leather vests, often missed the truth of who people really are. For Clara, the memory of those cruel boys would fade, but the feeling of Roar kneeling beside her wheelchair, his voice steady as he declared her family, would remain forever. She understood now that strength came in many forms. Sometimes it looked like a towering man with a beard and patches, and sometimes it looked like a girl who survived humiliation with her spirit intact. The patrons of Maplewood Diner learned something too. The older man with gray temples, who had first reached out to help Clara, nodded at her from across the room, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. His small act had been a pebble that started the avalanche of kindness. Perhaps most importantly, the story of what happened spread throughout the small town of Maplewood. Parents spoke to their children about compassion. Teachers discussed the courage it takes to stand up for others. The diner itself became known as a place where everyone deserved respect. Clara finished her pancakes and looked out at the parking lot, where the motorcycles had stood in formation. She thought about how quickly life could change, how a moment of cruelty could be washed away by an ocean of kindness. The vest she now wore represented more than protection. It was a reminder that family could be found in unexpected places. As you reflect on Clara's story, remember that in a world where you can be anything, being kind might be the most powerful choice of all. Sometimes, all it takes is a single act of compassion to change the course of someone's life forever.